How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects. Candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
If you've ever lived or even passed through New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, particularly the Philadelphia metropolitan area, chances are that you've heard of Wawa. Wawa is a privately held, family-owned chain of convenience stores operating along the East Coast, and it's been around for the last, 60 years or so, maybe even more, but our guest will tell us more about that. Today, we know the brand for their hoagies and their sandwiches, and we know them for their gas stations, but most importantly, we know Wawa for the warm, welcoming feeling that you get when you enter any of their stores. And that level of consistency is never an accident. And so whenever I run into any kind of a place where I see that kind of consistency, it always makes me curious to know, what's going on there with their company's culture that makes all of this possible? Well, in today's episode of Culture Architects, we get our answers from the CEO of Wawa himself, Chris Gheysens. Chris started out with Wawa in 1997 as the company's CFO and later became the CEO back around 2012. And under his leadership, Wawa has steadily grown and maintained its ranking as one of America's largest private companies. But he's always attributed their success to their culture. And today we're setting out to know how and why. So Chris, welcome to the Culture Architects podcast.
Thank you, David. Really glad to be here.
It's just going to be a really fun conversation. And again, I'm such a huge Wawa fan. So I love going into a Wawa. I love buying things there. And so this is going to be really fun to learn more about it. So for a background standpoint, you have a background that's a little unusual to be, such a culture champion and architect. You have a background, as you had shared with me once before, as a finance guy in accounting. So how did you go from being an accountant to, first of all, to even working for Wawa? Give us that little background. And then I'm curious about how this all works.
Well, look, accountants have hearts too. There's an urban legend out there. So so I graduated Villanova University here locally in the Philadelphia area, not far from where our corporate headquarters are. And I worked for a big six firm at the time, shows my age a little bit because there's only big four now, and at Deloitte. And I remember a mentor there. I said, look, I'm entering my first year with about 30 other first years. What do I do to set myself apart, or give me any tips? And he said, look, go make friends with the scheduler, because she's the one that basically assigns the clients for the first years. I did that. And she gave me great advice. She said, look, this Wawa client. I said, oh, I know Wawa. I didn't know it was a client. We send people out there every year for the audit. We're going to put you on that client. And I went out there and fell in love with it. That was my first experience with Wawa back in '93 after I graduated Villanova. And so I was an accountant by trade, and I worked on sort of the other side of the fence for a number of years with Deloitte. But immediately, especially comparing and contrasting against other clients I had a lot in retail, recognized there was something special and different about this thing. We all knew as Wawa as a place to go and get a sandwich or coffee, as you said, but being on the inside just felt something different. And I joined Wawa in '97.
So what is it that, can you identify, what did you notice? So it was different. There's a different feeling here. There's a different way of being. Yeah. What were some of the things they did differently that caused you to say, this is unusual?
There was a sense of, even as an outsider, and let's face it, I was an auditor, and auditors don't arrive on scene, especially external auditors, as the most embraced and beloved. And
great, the auditors are coming today.
The accounting team at Wawa wasn't cheering the day they got up and knowing the auditors were arriving. So, but yet they made me feel that way. That's what primarily was different. I wasn't a burden, or the team at Deloitte wasn't a burden. We were embraced. There was a collegiality that you saw and felt in your one-on-one interactions and in the hallway, and just a sense that they cared. They cared a little bit more in their commitment to the business. They cared a little bit more about their customers. They cared a little bit more about each other. And even as an outsider, I got that sense early on in their interactions with me and what I observed clearly early on.
It's interesting. I think back to my entire career, my first career in the insurance industry and the second career, and I think about all the different companies we've worked with, and I always see this consistency that the way a company deals with its customers is usually consistent with the way they deal with each other and the way they deal with vendors and suppliers. Like, it's rare to find a company that's really deep into customer service and treats their vendors like crap.
Yeah.
You know, it's more of a pervasive way of looking at the world, I think.
I think that's right. I think that's right. And in our case, as I've learned since then, it's grounded in values, the values that, you know, underpin the individuals here, the leaders before me, and underpin our culture.
Yeah. So I saw in one of the interviews that you had done at one point, you talked about, or you described Wawa's culture as kind of like a melting pot of the Wood family values, which are the original family, and the Quaker roots of the company, and sort of the way that the Philly area works, because it is a Philly-based company. So tell me more about that. How did that evolve?
Yeah. And I still think that's accurate. You know, I'm looking here in front of me, column 1. This is put out by a former CEO, really our iconic CEO and leader family member, Dick Wood. This is in the mid-'80s. And he sort of lists some of the challenges in the business at the time, but then runs through his laundry list, as he said, of random thoughts about the environment of our company. And by environment, it was just a different word for culture. And people like me have this printed out and on their desk all over this building, in many of our stores. And it's you know, for those that, you know, not me, but others that were actually here at the time, they also would agree that it was that authenticity that came through from Dick around these things. And I share that because they're still a big part of our culture. There's a lot of things in here that say a disdain for flash, that there's much more about humility, about low ego. It's organization and associate first, and not, you know, leaders' ego that drives the agenda or the moment. It talks about the most important person in the company is the one ringing the cash register, not the one sitting in the seat I'm in right now. So there are a lot of that Quaker and Wood family heritage and values coming through, as Quakers certainly this idea of consensus driven, very important. Some might get a little from the outside, new to Wawa, or even an external vendor might say, boy, you guys operate a little slower than I would think as a retailer. It's because everyone has a say. We're very consensus driven, but when we get to that goal line, we know that everyone's there with us to go over it. So, and humility plays a really big part, really big part in our leaders. It's still a big part of what we call our servant leadership. Not a word we used that Dick used back then in the mid-'80s, but we've adopted and used, and actually have a servant leadership training center here on campus.
Wow.
But, you know, I would say that's a big element and foundation. But growing up in Philadelphia, I think my view of culture is you are a melting pot. You embody all of the influences in some way, shape, or form that come into you. And Philadelphia has a certain grittiness to it. It has a certain hustle to it. It has a certain neighborhoody feeling to it that shines through. And you go into different Wawas, whether it's in Delaware County, where I'm sitting now, or in Northeast Philadelphia, each of them has a tiny bit of a different personality that's really a reflection, I think, of the community that they're in. And that's because people in that community shop, they call it their Wawa. It was actually a tagline of ours for years from customers of my Wawa, because that's how they referred to it, my Wawa. And that's not always done in retail. So there's certainly this element of my Wawa that comes through from the community and the neighborhoods we serve. And that's, you know, I just read something today where someone talked about this idea that we don't put in automatic doors in our stores, that you have to manually open the door. And when you're walking out with a bag of goods or products, sometimes that's not easy. And the reality is it's because people love to hold the doors just a little bit longer for their fellow customer when they walk or leave inside or outside of a Wawa. And that's really something that came from Philadelphia. As gritty as the town is, you know, we grew up here. And I've always wanted to measure this, David. You know, maybe put that in the finance accounting side of me of, is that reality true? And our engineers, our operating engineers, have gone out in the years past. We get an extra step or two versus other retailers where people will hold the door because, again, it's a part of that culture that's come on through the communities that we serve.
It's really interesting. I mean, I never thought about that, but I think when you're in an environment where people are friendly, you feel better, you feel more comfortable, and you do tend to want to reciprocate in some way. And so it makes sense to me that if I'm walking into a Wawa and everybody's friendly and people are smiling and the associate, you refer to them as associates? The associates
yes,
are warm and making you feel like they're glad you're there. Yeah, you would want to hold the door open a little longer for someone coming in because you just feel like I'm in this community of people who behave in a certain kind of way.
That's right. That too. And what I say is typically Wawa's, because we're so dense, it's a pretty tight trade area. The odds are you're at the coffee island in the morning, preparing your coffee, you're rubbing elbows with someone you might not know exactly, or you might know very well, but you might see him at church, or you might see him on the soccer field, or you might see him later at a school meeting, or they might be a teacher for your child. The community's pretty tight at the end of the day. And I think there's this town square, town hall type feel to it that there's a little bit of a higher calling of, maybe I need to be in my best. I'm going to show up to Wawa maybe in my pajamas today because that's the way I want to arrive. We are comfortable and welcoming, but I'm going to be a little nicer because these are people that are really down the street from where I live or work or play type of thing.
Yeah. Now, as I'm thinking about as our audience listens to this conversation and what you and I have just been talking about, there may be a mistake on audience part of thinking this is this small little, local cozy kind of thing. So share with our audience, like how many associates do you have and how many locations do you have?
Yeah. As we record this, we have just over 48,000 Wawa associates. Wow. We have just over 1,100 stores. They're all company owned and operated. And your average Wawa is a bit different than maybe your average convenience store. For us, our store size is about 6,500 square feet. Your average convenience store in the industry is maybe about 2,000 square feet. So a much larger box. We're really known for our fresh food and drinks. So we compete in #1 in market share in drip coffee. We compete with a Starbucks, just a different price point for espresso-based drinks and things like that, milkshakes they call frappuccinos. And yet we're known for our hoagies. We're known for our breakfast sandwiches. So we would, to give you just a sense of scale, sell more in food than your average McDonald's. So, and McDonald's in a consideration set would be the #1 consideration if I'm not going to go to a Wawa. So, think of Dunkin' for coffee and Starbucks, think of McDonald's and Wendy's and Chick-fil-A for lunch. We're competing across all those day parts. And then there's the gasoline part. We would sell more gas per site than really almost anyone in the country. We're a really high volume retailer, and we look to democratize just a slightly better experience when people are on their way between point A and point B. We want that stop in the middle, that in between, to be the most cherished few minutes of their day, because we recognize and respect the time crunch that everyone in society is under. And we know that going from point A to point B might not be the best place in the world, or point A where you came from might not be the best thing. And we just want to make sure that we try to give you that little, as you said, comfortable, warm, welcome everybody in a spot where you can just feel at ease for a few minutes.
So, it's such a cool thing. And again, easy to do if you have one location or two locations and everybody's in the same building and we can convey the culture that we want to all of these people. Yeah. But that's a completely different task or challenge to have 48,000 associates and try to create a reasonably consistent experience so that anywhere that I go to a Wawa in the country, I know that I'm going to have this positive experience. How do you pull that off?
Yeah. It's hard. Let's make no mistake. And I'm too much of a pragmatist to sit here and tell you we get it perfect 2 million times a day. We see about 2 million customers a day.
2 million, wow.
But our store associates, there's a lot to it. And as much as I've tried to wrap my mind around the answer to a question that I've been asked a million times, there's so many components. So one, I think it starts with a business strategy of consistency. Our strategy of, if you go into a Wawa in New Jersey or Virginia or Florida or now Ohio, there's a certain consistency and reliability that we want in the customer service and the offer. a hoagie is going to taste the same in Ohio as it does in Florida, as it does in New Jersey. And yes, we understand there's difference in water and bread and things like that. Mm-hmm. So, but it starts there with that promise, and that promise carries over to a service and a culture which is tied to it. So we do a bunch around it. One, we celebrate, talk about, and reward our associates around culture all the time. It's catching associates in the moment of truth, as we like to say. I do a weekly You Rock award on video for the company of simply one of the dozens of letters or emails that I get about unique things that our associates are doing to live the culture. Really, customers might not call it that, but it's really what it is. Two, we have leaders that are really across the board more tenured than most retailers because we're partially employee owned. We're actually, our largest shareholders, our employees as a group, our associates own almost 40% of the company. So they're owners. It's more than a job. It's carrying a culture and a service and doing a great thing today because it's going to take care of me as an owner long term. And then we try to really invest in unique ways. We have training. Certainly that's important, but training isn't always the culture answer. It's a way to get consistency, but you have to be clear around that culture expectation. So for example, we've just opened in Indiana and Ohio, new markets, a big leap for us. And the way that we get culture implanted is we really seek out and ask some of our best cultural ambassador leaders of stores, people leaders, and they move. And they've moved permanently in many cases to these new markets to set up shop for us. The leader and then the leadership team in the first handful of stores in new markets will really be people that have known our culture. And so that's a critical moment for us to help embed culture in a new store in a new geography. But boy, there's so many institutions that we have, so many different ways that we recognize and not really just reward, but reinforce culture. Our internal care team, for an example, our culture, I think, is, we look at it as almost two dichotomies. We highly care about our people and we're results oriented, which can be a conflicting culture at times. We have an internal care team that reports directly to me, about a dozen associates, social workers and others that just take care of our associates when they hit a road bump in life. That is a huge cultural thing to put forward. It reports directly to the CEO, and it's a team that is there to celebrate your great times in life, a marriage, a birth of a new child, but is also there to help maybe with an unexpected death, even if it's a financial assistance. So there's lots of things we do to just reinforce culture, and probably some of them work and probably some of them don't. And that's the challenge. It's like advertising. You know that half of it works and half of it doesn't. You just don't know which half is which.
Yeah. You know, when I think about companies in retail, particularly, who appear to do quite an extraordinary job at this and finding the right balance between people first and results, I think of Chick-fil-A. I mean, clearly they outdo everybody in that end of the fast food chain, competition. And at the same time, they're clearly people first and create a different experience for people. And when I've spoken to people at Chick-fil-A before, I've always had the impression that they're very picky about who they hire, that they're really, they will turn down an awful lot of candidates at every level before hiring the right people. So I'm curious, where Wawa is on that. Like, how do you go about, not you specifically, but the organization, how does the organization go about hiring and specifically finding people who are going to thrive in the Wawa culture?
Yeah, so I think it's best to maybe break up the groups, if you will, although we don't think of it that way internally, but at store level, in the simplest way, we're hiring for smiles and attitude, and we can train the rest usually. It depends on the role in the stores. But the store team, and similarly the corporate team, if someone joins that's really not a part of the culture, and that can be dangerous, but not a part of the culture here is strong enough that it's going to eject that person. It's going to be organ rejection. But at store level, we do have some surveys, questionnaires, online documents that everyone fills out that helps give us a sense of their aptitude around service, friendliness, and connection. That's really where we start at store level. Similarly here in our corporate office, even at very senior levels, I'm in the process of hiring a very senior level individual. We put them through a cultural screen with behavioral scientists, to be honest.
Wow.
So we get under the covers pretty significantly. They'll spend a day with them to understand. Interviews are an element of it. And our interviews, by the way, there's a lot. So right now, as I'm doing this, we have an executive that's in stores as part of the interview process, touring and with a senior store person. It is, to us and me, one of the most telling things when you put a senior executive into a store environment. Who are they comfortable talking with? How do they engage associates at very different levels? You know, one of the things I say, borrowed from Jay Wright of Villanova basketball, is our status is the same, even though our roles might be different. And so all of that needs to come out, and we will have the team that will report to the individual actually as part of the interview process. And to say, is this someone that I would follow behind, and not you know, someone that has to earn my followership, but do I get the sense that they have the culture and the values and the attributes to get that? So, so for us, it's a really important process. Now in retail, it's difficult. We have the best in class retail turnover, which is one measure. A lot don't measure retention. So sometimes there's a small group that rotates a little bit further. We're now looking at retention and making sure that we're retaining our most beloved, if you will, associates that have been here the longest, that understand our culture the most, because that's really the center of our culture in our stores. The handful of associates that, you know, maybe a general manager will come and go in a store because they're looking to get promoted and moving on to a different store that needs assistance. There's usually a handful of associates in a store that are there for 20, 30 years. Wow. They're the ones that anchor that store and the culture in it. And they're the ones we want to make sure that we're keeping, we're engaging with, and we're retaining over the long term.
Folks, that's the end of the first part of my conversation with Chris Gheysens, the CEO of Wawa. When we resume on the next episode of Culture Architects, Chris is going to tell us a lot more about how he manages to keep culture as Wawa's biggest competitive weapon, and how, to use his own words, culture is a great big feedback loop. Our guest has such a dynamic and intentional approach to culture, and I'm sure you're also excited for what else he has to say. So make sure you stay tuned.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders in all walks of life. To book David for your next event, or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of CultureWise.